but also help us to use these things to strengthen us and ground us and make us better. Thank you for Stu and all the work that he's put into preparing this class, and please help us to be attentive to the things that he has to share with us. Bless us, Father. Help us to have open minds and open hearts to understand the things that we find in your word and to understand them better every day. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Brother Miles. Okay. We're going to start here in Acts chapter 24. And before we begin, we've got a new memory verse, which you do not see there, but it is Hebrews. If everybody wants to turn over to Hebrews, the 3rd chapter, Hebrews 3 and verse 14. Hebrews 3 and verse 14. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. All right. So I'm going to put you guys on the spot today because we're going to use the little ABC tool, and there's no helpful hints up back there. All right, here we go. So get your Bibles ready here. Remember Bible classes when we were kids, like everybody's turned to the right chapter as quickly as possible? I'll give you a hint. Our first one is from chapter 1. What does the A stand for? Yep. Who said that? Ascension, that's right. Ascension and the apostle chosen. Very good. Well, you got the easy one. That's good. Good point for you. So let's go A, B, C, D, E. Chapter 5 is E. Anybody got E? Nice try, but eh. Empty jail. Very, very good. Very, very good. So the empty jail. And who does that refer to? Peter and John. Okay, so they had been preaching. They had been placed under arrest, and they had miraculously able to escape that. So the empty jail. All right, this one should be a little bit easier. Chapter 7. So that's E, F, G. This isn't Jeopardy. Yes, who is Stephen? Yeah, so G for the great hero. All right, and what was great about Stephen? Why would you consider him a great hero? Courage in the face of death, prospective death. Yeah, he was arguing in a not a mean way, but articulating the story of Jesus with the Hellenistic Jews. There was a lot of conflict, and he set them off, and they wound up stoning him. So G, chapter 7 for great hero. Okay, we'll add 10 to that. So chapter 17, Q. Chapter 17, Q. No, but thanks for trying. Yes. Hunter's coming through for us there this morning. Questions answered at Athens. What kind of questions were those? Who was doing the answering? Don't answer. Who is doing the answer? Who's doing the questioning? Who's doing the answering? Richard? Paul was doing the answering.
One true God.
An amazing, I think it's one of my favorite chapters. It's one of my favorite chapters in Acts. Is Paul, at this time, how would you characterize Paul's demeanor, attitude, or kind of how he was feeling? Anybody remember kind of how he was feeling? He was provoked when he was walking through, but what was his emotions at the time?
He was distressed.
Yes, he was. Very, very good. He was distressed, depressed. He was alone. He was alone in the city of Athens, and he sees it, and he was provoked by seeing those idols. He was walking through the marketplace. Really an amazing, amazing story there in chapter 17. And then we come to chapter 24, which is X. It's just kind of a tricky question because what words start with X? Xylophone, xenogram, X-ray. Yeah, those are not. None of those are it. It's for excuse. E-X-C-U-S-E. So the excuse of Felix is chapter 24. And as we've moved through Luke's account, we've seen the apostles really fulfill Jesus' directive. Now, this goes back quite a bit away, but what was the directive of Jesus? We saw this very, very early in Acts, the first chapter. In Acts, the first chapter, in verse 8, This was the directive that Jesus had right from the beginning, and this is what we've been seeing being fulfilled throughout our study of the book of Acts. What was that directive? Acts chapter 1, verse 8. Yes, Matthew?
To be his witnesses in Jerusalem, then in Judea and Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth.
Exactly right. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea and Samaria, and then in the entire, to the end of the earth. And so we're really nearing the end of that fulfillment. As Luke records for us the culmination of Paul's ministry and his missionary work here. And the last few weeks we've looked at this uproar in Jerusalem that resulted last week in a very brief dialogue with the Sanhedrin Council. So what was it why did that kind of get short shifted there? He sets it up like, the tribune puts Paul in front of the Sanhedrin Council. He gets them all together. He's going to get to the bottom of the story, and then it really just gets derailed. Why does it get derailed? What does Paul do? He kind of throws the hand grenade in the room.
Speaks about the resurrection of the dead and knows how that's going to divide the crowd.
The Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? And so he kind of tosses that hand grenade into the room, and it really does kind of blows up the meeting, and things kind of stop there in midstream. In the account of these events, Luke really actually records some fairly interesting things for us. One, Paul was falsely accused of teaching. He was falsely accused of teaching against three things. One was the Jewish nation, and this is from Acts 21 and verse 8. He was accused of teaching against the Jewish nation, the old law, and the temple. Why would that have been a big deal to these people that he's talking to? What was their life centered around? This group of leaders that he's, woo, baby, look at that. We are in business. All right. Thank you, guys.
Against everything that they believe.
And their whole life was centered around, right? The temple, the old law, their chosen nation status as being the children of God, the only children of God, right? So he's being accused of preaching against these three things that really are going to turn their world upside down. And in addition to those accusations by these false witnesses and false accusations, Paul's struck in the mouth. You remember that? He's struck in the mouth at the command of the high priest. And what does he call the Jews? What does he call the high priest? Whitewashed wall, exactly right. He calls him this whitewashed wall. You think about that scene, what other event does that remind you of?
Jesus.
Yes. It should remind us of Jesus. It should remind us of the scene at Jesus' trial, the night that Jesus was betrayed. And if you look at this, it's in John 18, verse 19. John 18, verse 19. The high priest is questioning Jesus, a different high priest than Ananias that we're talking about here today. But the high priest is questioning Jesus, and an officer strikes Jesus, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" It's very similar to what we have here and what Luke has portrayed for us here. The similarities are eerie. So what ultimately happened, if we think about the story of Jesus, what ultimately happened in the story of Jesus' interaction with the Jewish rulers? He was falsely accused. Does that sound familiar? He was beaten. He was humiliated. He was turned over to the Romans. What did the Romans say about Jesus? Not guilty. So he was turned over to the Romans. There was no guilt found in him. They wanted to let him go. And ultimately, the Jews persuaded the Romans to kill Jesus, despite having no evidence, no transgression, no guilt. Now, if you're Paul and you're sitting in prison, that might make you a little nervous about the way things are going here. What kind of path are we going? We've seen this before. I might be a little worried. So in chapter 23 and verse 11, last week, we saw that the Lord appeared to Paul and tells him what? Take courage. Chapter 23 and verse 11. Take courage. Why? Because he's seen this story before. He knows how this ended up with the Jewish rulers before and the Romans, trying to appease each other. And Jesus ultimately was sacrificed on the cross. So he's scared. He's nervous about this. The Lord appears to Paul and tells him, take courage, For as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. So it's about 2 weeks, about 12 days actually, since Paul arrived in Jerusalem, and we find ourselves now in this other city. It's called Caesarea Maritima. And this is an interesting place. Stephen showed some slides last week of this ancient city right there on the coast. And here's a couple more that I found interesting. This is the journey that Paul is going to take to Rome, and where we find ourselves today here is in this city of Caesarea. You remember he had been taken from Jerusalem to Caesarea, sent there after the plot against him was found out by Paul's nephew. So this is a picture of where the harbor would have been. Now, what you see here is much smaller than what the harbor would have been at that time. Anybody remember who built Caesarea Maritima? Herod the Great. He was known as being great because he was a great builder. What else did he build? Somebody said it, I heard. What else did he build in Jerusalem on top of a mount? The temple. He built the temple. So Herod the Great, also the baby killer, right, from Matthew 2. So Herod begins to develop lots of things in Judea, and specifically he built this city. It was very insignificant before Herod the Great came along, and he puts in this huge harbor. And the harbor was built using some materials that's pretty innovative at the time that allowed the concrete to harden while under the water. So I don't understand all of that, but it's pretty interesting. That harbor at the time, so when Paul was there, that harbor, that looks pretty small there, but the harbor at the time was over 40 acres and would have held 300 ships. It was a big place. It was a very important place. So much larger than the modern harbor that exists today. This is the aqueduct, so that he built the city on the coast. They didn't have any fresh water. So he built this aqueduct. You can see here the arches. This aqueduct actually started 10 miles inland near Mount Carmel. So nearly 10 miles away near Mount Carmel, they started and collected the fresh water through this aqueduct system. Hadrian, Emperor Hadrian, and the Crusaders actually added to those different channels to Herod's aqueduct that he had put there. And then finally, there's this promontory. I think Stephen had a picture of this, but Josephus called this palace that was built on this promontory that stuck out into the ocean. There was a pool in the center of this big structure, full of fresh water that was like the size of a lake. Apparently, it's really large, and had a big statue standing in the center. It was pretty amazing building. Apparently, Paul may have even been imprisoned in that. You'll remember in Acts 23:35 it says where the Felix kept him in Herod's praetorium. So that actually may have been this palace that was on this promontory. So pretty amazing place that was built and where we find ourselves today. And so Felix is ruling this now. It had been ruled by the Herods before. Herods are not in the picture in this area of Judea. Now it's Felix who is appointed. And so our first question for this morning for chapter 24 is who is, did you see that? Did you like that? Here, let's just go back. Let's do that again. Okay, here, look. Yes, look at that. That was a diagram or a picture taken off of a coin that was supposedly Felix's likeness. So Felix, as Stephen mentioned last week, Antonius Felix, he was a Greek freedman. So he had been a slave. He and his brother. His brother Paulus, also a freed slave, was a really high official in Rome. In fact, he was the treasurer. He was a very powerful official. The Roman Senate was openly hostile towards Paulus based upon his background, but the Emperor Claudius appointed him as the secretary of the treasury. He actually became one of the richest men in Rome at the time in the Roman Empire. It was Paulus, Felix's brother, who advocated for Felix to become the governor or the procurator of Judea. And that happened around AD 52. So in AD 52, he became the governor of Judea and that surrounding area, and he remained in power until AD 59. All right? So what does that tell us? If he remained in power until AD 59, we're going to learn that Paul stayed here for how many years? 2 years. So he was here in Caesarea for 2 years, hanging out with Felix. And so what does that tell us about where this time period was? This must be AD, right around AD 57. So AD 57, Felix was the first ex-slave to become governor of a province. It's pretty amazing. And Felix was also married 3 times. So 3 times, and his first 2 wives had the same name, Drusilla. So the first Drusilla is not the one that's mentioned here. It's the second Drusilla. She was a Jewess is mentioned here in Acts 24. And this Drusilla is the daughter of King Agrippa, Herod Agrippa the first. Let's see if we can. So remember Herod the Great. We mentioned already that he rebuilt the temple, he built this city, and he was the killer of many babies after he had been tricked by the wise men. And so the wise men took off, and Herod the Great gets mad, and he makes that declaration to kill all the male boys, the male children, 2 years and younger. So, anybody remember what nationality Herod the Great was?
Yeah, Idumean.
He was Idumean. He was an Edomite. Yeah, Idumean. So he's obviously really famous for that area. And he did some amazing things in terms of building, but he was not a good guy and became, they thought, insane later and died a horrible death. So then we have Herod Agrippa the First. Now, Herod Agrippa the First, if you look at this, was the son of Aristobulus. So he would be a grandson. So he's a grandson of Herod the Great. His claim to fame is that he killed James the Apostle. Remember that? That's from Acts the 12th chapter. So Herod the Great, Herod the Agrippa, his grandson, and then today we get to Drusilla, married to Felix and a daughter of Herod Agrippa the First, therefore a great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. So Felix was not well spoken of by the historians. There was a famous writer, Tacitus, who said, and this was a quote, Felix exercised the power of a king with the mind of a slave. That's how he was thought of. He also said that Felix believed himself free to commit any type of crime that he wanted. He was generally regarded as an incompetent administrator. So an incompetent administrator who used excessive violence even allowed the citizens of that area to be plundered and mistreated. And Josephus wrote that under his rule, that Jewish violence actually escalated, and rebellion in Judea reached new heights under Felix's reign. And these are really important facts that we get to in the discussion between the Jews that have come now to Caesarea, and the political background kind of informs us and helps us understand the situation that we're about to talk about. The political situation was so unstable in that area that the Roman governors were really careful. They didn't want to alienate, they didn't want to ostracize their Jewish constituents at that time. After Felix left office, so Felix leaves office in AD 59, the violence got so out of control, so out of hand and escalated, that ultimately that led to the Jewish-Roman War, which started in AD 66 and finalized in AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Yes, Brother Nix. So this was a really rough time in the relationships between Rome and the Jews, the Jewish nation. And what we're seeing is this interplay and the political background where Paul has been thrown into this kind of political mess and what he does with that situation. So let's take a look at Acts the 24th chapter, and let's read verses 1 through 9 of Acts 24. And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. They laid before the governor their case against Paul. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, "Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation in every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. For we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world, and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him." The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. So, who was Tertullus and what role did he play? 5 days after Paul arrives in Caesarea. It's really kind of this prosecution team. The Jewish prosecution team arrives to state their charges against them, and it was composed of the high priest, Ananias, some other Jewish leaders, and then this guy, Tertullus, this spokesman named Tertullus. Now, Tertullus was a common Greek name at the time. He was probably a Hellenistic Jew, and he was chosen, really, if you think about it, he's chosen to be their spokesman for a purpose. He probably was a good orator. He probably had expertise in Roman law and Jewish law. And the Sanhedrin, essentially what they're doing is they're saying, hey, we need to get an expert. This didn't work out for us so great last week, so let's get an expert. Let's hire somebody to come and be our spokesperson. So Tertullus really is going to act as their attorney, essentially. Questions or comments about Tertullus, or any other thoughts on Tertullus? Interesting little interplay there. So throw in the spokesman Tertullus, and they're going to get down to business here. So, what evidence was presented by Tertullus of his charge? You look back at that section that we just read, Tertullus starts off with what? A big dose of, what would we call it? He's buttering him up. I love that. Flattery. Buttering him up. All right? So, he starts with this big dose of flattery. Look at verses 2 and 3 again. This is since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation, in every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. But we don't want to waste your time. To detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. Is that what we just talked about, how Felix was seen? No. That's all a bunch of baloney. They didn't like Felix. He wasn't making great reforms that were in their favor. In fact, he was causing death and mistreatment of these Jewish citizens, to the fact that he got relieved. He got pulled out of that in AD 59, nearly lost his life. So in AD 59, he gets pulled out because he's mistreating these people. So what is Tertullus doing? He's buttering him up. He's flattering. He's trying to like, hey, you're a great guy, Felix. So that's not what history records about Felix's rule. And in fact, as we just mentioned, just the opposite. He was notorious for taking bribes. He allowed those citizens to be mistreated. He absolutely committed crimes against the people. He inflamed the people. As I mentioned, that led to his removal in AD 59. But he makes 4 charges against Paul. First one is, and Hunter, I think you said that, he's a pest. He's a pest and he's a danger to the public. The second one, he's a creator of dissension. He's a leader in rebellion. He's a troublemaker. And number 3, he's a ringleader in the sect of the Nazarenes. And the fourth charge was he would have profaned the temple if we hadn't stopped him. So notice his emphasis here. He's saying Paul is a ringleader of a faction. And with that faction, what's the problem with that faction? It could spell real trouble for you guys in Rome. Right? It's a problem to the public here. This is a real problem. He's a problem. Originally, what was the charge against Paul a few days before? Was the charge that he was trying to profane the temple, or what was the charge? That he had profaned the temple by what? Bringing a Gentile, Trophimus, right? So he was charged with bringing. Well, where's that? Why'd they leave that out? Why do you think he left that out? It wasn't true. It didn't happen. That's exactly right. So now they've kind of modified this charge to be that he tried to profane the temple. He then offers a tremendous amount of evidence, right? No, he does not. What's he say?
He's a ringleader of riots all over the world.
Say that again?
He's a ringleader of riots all over the world.
He's a ringleader of riots all over the world, right? So that's what he's trying to say, and then he gets the Jews to say, they said, yeah, we agree. Yeah, we think so too. So the other Jews that came with him, they just kind of stand up and say, and we agree with Tertullus, what he just said. Yeah, what he said. That's good. That's the evidence. That's all the evidence that he presented. No evidence, in fact, that any of that happened. Some of you may have a footnote. So Tertullus wants to make it seem that Paul was kind of captured in the act now before he could desecrate the temple. Right, so it kind of changed this accusation. It said we caught him before he was able to desecrate desecrate the temple. So some of you may have this footnote as of verse 7 or something added to the end of verse 6 and into verse 7. In fact, in the English Standard Version, there is no verse 7. I don't know if any of you guys have something similar. But in some manuscripts, they have a verse 7 and part of a verse 6, and it goes like this. And we would have judged him. So it comes after the end of verse 6. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him, and we would have judged him in accordance with our law. But the commander Lysias came and took him from us with much violence, ordering his accusers to come before you. This is in some manuscripts, not all manuscripts. Some manuscripts will leave this out, but it does add really kind of an interesting dimension to the account. If it hadn't been for his, and the way Tertullus is kind of portraying this, if it hadn't been for this very orderly and speedy arrest, this is what would have happened. That's not at all what happened. What did we see? What was happening at the time? It was a mob scene. It was a mob scene, and Paul was being beaten. He was being beaten, and they were trying to kill him until Lysias intervened, looking over the wall, the Fortress Antonia, looking over the wall. They saw, hey, something bad's happening there. Goes in there and stops what's happening. Paul was being beaten at the time. But this really adds this interesting dimension. If this verse describes part of Tertullus' argument, it's implied here that the Jews had planned to try Paul themselves, try him according to their law, most likely for a crime against the temple. And Tertullus, in this verse, is really blaming the Roman commander for interrupting what Tertullus is claiming was about to be this very legal hearing on the matter by the council. That's not what was happening. That's not what was going to happen. He was going to be killed. But that might explain why Felix later insists on postponing the case until Lysias could come to Caesarea and give his testimony. So finally, Tertullus recommends that Felix examine Paul himself. What did that look like when Lysias was about to examine Paul? Anybody remember what that was going to consist of? How did they examine people then? Torture. What happens when you get tortured? You spill the beans, right? That's what the idea behind torture is, right? It may not be the truth, but you're going to say something because you're being tortured. So the way they examined them, that's why Paul was drawn out to be scourged. Lysias was going to examine him. What is Tertullus asking Felix to do? To torture him. Tertullus is trying to get him to scourge him, to torture him, to get a confession out of Paul. That's what he's asking. This is not just, hey, you might want to ask him some questions. He's saying, put the whip to him. You'll get the right answer. So Paul is, again, in danger of his life, and Tertullus recommends that Felix essentially torture Paul to get the right answers. And this is really similar to the situation in Matthew 26 at the trial that Jesus had with the Sanhedrin. The council members were looking for false evidence against Jesus. For what purpose? They wanted to kill Jesus. They wanted to put him to death. Why is Tertullus asking Felix to do this? They want to put Paul to death. That's the purpose here. The same is true here in Paul's trial. So how did Paul answer these four charges? Let's look back at our text. Let's look beginning in verse 10 of chapter 24. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, "Knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense." Pardon me. I cheerfully make my defense. You can verify that it was not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem, and they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. Now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple, without any crowd or tumult, but some Jews from Asia, and they ought to be here before you to make an accusation should they have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council, other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them. It is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. So, Paul starts his defense. He starts his defense by acknowledging Felix's experience as a judge. Is this the same type of flattery that Tertullus gave? What is this based on? It's based on truth, right? So he's saying he had experience as the governor of the region, right? Did Felix have experience as the governor of the region? Yes, several years. If he had been there, if Felix has been here for several years as governor of this province, do you think Felix has had any interaction with the Jews and the Jewish leaders? Do you think they've had experience? Do you think Felix knows how the Jewish leaders act? Yeah, he's had a lot of experience with them. So Paul starts his defense by saying, I know, Felix, essentially, he's saying, I know you've seen how these Jews act. I know you've interacted with these Jewish leaders before, which he had. And he's going to be able to see him. And because of that, I'm happy to make my defense to you. He's ready. Has Paul ever not been happy to make a defense for himself? He's always stood up for himself. He's always been willing to tell the truth. First, though, after that, he notes that one, they can't prove any of the accusations. Not a one. They can't prove. It's only been a few days. What is he saying? What is he saying to Felix, essentially? What can you do? What can Felix do?
Well, he could bring some more witnesses.
He can get some more witnesses. It's only been 12 days. There's people that are around that you could talk to see if this is true or not. Felix can independently verify his story. There's plenty of people around. It's not that far. He had only recently come to Jerusalem. Paul had only recently come to Jerusalem. There's plenty of witnesses that are available, including who? The tribune Lysias. You can get him down here. Not only that, they didn't find him inciting a crowd in the temple, not in a synagogue, not anywhere in the city. They can't prove anything they're saying. And after denying all these charges, you could probably hear a pin drop. Because after all these charges, he says, but I am about to confess to something. What? He's going to confess. Everybody listen up. What's he going to confess to? What's he say? Not a chargeable offense, not what he was talking about here. But if you look at verse 14, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. Now, the phrase God of our ancestors would have been very familiar to the Jews. That comes from Exodus, the 13th chapter. God of our ancestors. What is Paul essentially saying? Paul is saying the Jews would have known this, that Paul was claiming to worship the same God that the Jews worship. That's what he's saying. Not only that, Paul had once persecuted those who followed the way. And so now you have this ironic turn of events. Well, instead of Paul persecuting the Christians, Paul himself is being persecuted for being a Christian. Paul claims also that his being a Christian didn't mean that he was violating the Scriptures. What's he say in verse 14? I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. He insists that he is living his life according to the law and the prophets. Paul chose his words very, very carefully, and Luke records them for us very, very carefully for a purpose. He only believed and practiced what was in harmony with the written law, with the Scriptures. It's a pretty clever way of saying what about the Jews standing before Felix? Who are the ones who are transgressing the law? These guys. Not me. I wasn't causing a revolt in the city. I wasn't defaming the temple. I wasn't desecrating the temple. I wasn't causing an uproar in the synagogues. I wasn't causing any problems in the city. I was quietly going about my business. Not only that, I brought alms. I brought money. He says, I have, in verse 15, I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. Now, he'd already raised this issue before. We already mentioned before this is kind of the hand grenade, this kind of the landmine that he kind of tossed into the room back in chapter 23. It's interesting to me that didn't cause the same uproar. So the Sanhedrin Council, the high priest of the sect of the Sadducees, they're here. So the high priest is here. There's some other elders, though, and we don't know who those other elders are or who those other Jewish leaders are. But it didn't have the same impact this time that it had in the meeting of the Sanhedrin. Probably because the high priest realized that wouldn't get them what they were wanting here. So, knowing, though, that the high priest and other members of that Sadducee party didn't share this belief, and as I mentioned, the other elders were not really sure who those were, but there was a good chance that they could have been Pharisees and that they would have believed in the resurrection. The other key is that the people of the land, who did the people of the land really connect with? The Sadducees, these rulers with lots of money, or the Pharisees that were teachers of the law? The Pharisees. So the people tended to connect with and trust and believe those high priests, the Sadducees, those were appointed positions by this time. These guys were being appointed by Rome, by Roman leaders, right? They still met the criteria for being Levites, but they were appointed, right? So this isn't what we had in the Old Testament. Yes, sir.
Had the Sadducees raised a huge objection, they may have shown themselves to Rome that they were the problem.
Yes. It would have highlighted the fact, and this is what Paul's getting at, it would have highlighted the fact that this is a theological issue. This is not a political issue. You didn't see me inciting riots. The things that they're claiming I didn't do, and you can prove that if you listen to other people.
Well, and you mentioned how you could go back and hear Lysias and get statements from him. Well, he has his letter already, and in the letter he said, well, he hasn't done anything deserving death or chains, and it just seems like it's a squabble among their own philosophy. And so he's already telling him, so unless there's something in this little trial that shows differently, he's probably going to go with Lysias.
Yeah, because a really good point. So he had the letter from Lysias that already kind of alluded to the fact that, hey, I didn't see anything here worthy of death. And this seems to be a squabble between these guys. So the Pharisees certainly taught among the people, were respected by them, and so in that sense, Paul really would have been in step in terms of these theological beliefs. Paul would have been in step with the Jewish nation regarding the idea of the resurrection. So really skillfully, Paul very skillfully moves the debate, the discussion here about talking about insurrection and profaning the temple or causing uprisings in the city. He turns this from this insurrection and political debate, and what's he turn it to? This is a theological discussion of the resurrection. Very skillfully kind of turns that around. And by doing so, he really focuses on a very substantive issue of the gospel, the resurrection. And at the same time, he gets to really the crux of the Jews' real problem with him. The bottom line is the Jews had a problem with Paul's theology, with Paul's the way, with Jesus Christ being resurrected, being the Son of God. And so Paul was able to really deflect the Jews' attempts to frame their allegations in a political context and get them convicted of these crimes against the state. So through the charges of being a plague and a creator of dissension, he shows that he quietly went about his work. To the charge that he was a ringleader of a sect, he responded that he was of the way which believes in the resurrection. To the charge of trying to profane the temple, he points out that he had gone into the temple and he had brought alms to the Jews, totally discounting the claims that Tertullus and the Jewish leaders were making there. So let's look at question number 5. Any other thoughts about Tertullus and that little interplay there? Appreciate those comments very much. In chapter 24, look at verse 22 and verse 23. But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. Then he gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. Now, Tim mentioned already that what did he have from Lysias? He had a letter. And did it address these issues already? Yes, it did. So why do you think he said, hey, we'll wait till Lysias comes down, and then we'll talk about it?
Garner favor with the Jews.
Garner favor with the Jews. Stall, right? I don't want to make a decision right now. It's a little kind of hot in here. We got some conflict here. Things are not going so well with the Jews right now. I certainly don't want to condemn an innocent man who's a Roman citizen. That wouldn't go well for him. But I also don't want to hack off the Jewish leaders here. So he's kind of in this difficult situation. So he delays. He delays a decision on the matter about Paul because he had a better understanding of Christianity than most. Don't you think that's interesting? Where did he hear that from? How did he come into contact with it? We're not told. But he had, it says, a rather accurate knowledge of the way. Before this had happened, he knew about the way. Do you think Jesus' directive to the apostles has come true? I want you to be my witnesses everywhere. It has. Felix the governor, appointed by Rome, appointed by the emperor, had an accurate understanding of Christianity. I find that fascinating. So Felix wasn't deceived by Tertullus. He wasn't deceived by the Jewish leaders at all. He clearly understood that the charges against Paul were theological. They weren't criminal by any stretch of the imagination. And he noted that he'd wait until he got more information from Lysias, right? Nice stall job. How far was Caesarea Maritime from Judea? Miles, right? A few miles. Not a tremendous journey. They did it in one night when they were bringing Paul there. He noted that he was going to wait until he got more information from Lysias, although he already had the letter. We're told later that what he really wanted was money. He wanted a bribe. Why is that true? We know his history tells us he liked bribes. He took money. He was a bad administrator. He was a crooked guy. He was a bad politician. And he was hoping that Paul would provide money. What did Paul bring with him to Jerusalem? A large amount of money. A lot of money. You think Felix knew that? I bet Felix knew that. Said he'd brought alms for the nation. Story probably got around. Felix was waiting for a bribe. Did Lysias ever come down? Did he send a letter and said, hey, Lysias, come right down. I want to hear what you have to say. No. There's no indication that Lysias ever made it down or gave additional testimony. It's probably because he never called for him. If he had called for Lysias to come down, would Lysias have come down? Yes. He's the governor. He's over the tribune. Most likely he was never summoned. Most likely Felix never even intended to summon him. So then we have this situation where Felix says, we're going to keep him in custody. He's going to have some liberty. Let his friends take care of him. Let his friends attend to his needs. And then in verse 24, we have the situation where Felix brings his wife with him, Drusilla, who is a Jewess. Let's read verses 24 through 27. After some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who is Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Jesus Christ. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, "Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you." At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. So he sent for him often and conversed with him. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So our next question here is about the content of the sermon that Paul presented to Felix and Drusilla. Look at that. A few days later, Felix brings his wife, the Jewish Drusilla, to hear about Paul's faith in Christ Jesus. Remember, the daughter of Herod Agrippa I, the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. So this is a classic gospel sermon. How many points do you think Paul had here? 3 points. 3 points, and the lesson's yours. Amazingly enough. So, first one was righteousness. Right? What was he going to say about righteousness? We look at another book that Paul wrote about righteousness. If you look at Romans 1, verses 16 and 17, it tells us that God's plan for righteousness is revealed where? In the gospel. If you look at Romans 3 in verse 20 through 21, that righteousness comes through faith in Jesus Christ and requires submission. In Romans 10, requires submission to Jesus Christ. So he's talking about righteousness, a key component of the way, a key component of the gospel. The second point, he talks about self-control. Why did this cause Felix to go, oh no, let's not talk about this? What was Felix? Drusilla had already been married. There's you should look this up. There's more interesting stories about what happened. Drusilla, when Felix first saw Drusilla, she was 16 years old. She was already married to another king in a very small country in this very small area of Syria. But he's a really pretty unremarkable king and kingdom, not much influence. Well, Felix liked the look of Drusilla, and he actually talks a Jewish leader, a Jew of some sort, who he knew, and he got this Jew to pretend to be a magician and convince Drusilla that it was fate that she divorce her current husband, the king, in this small country, and become Felix's wife. Right? So there's lying, there's subterfuge, there's this magician, this kind of sorcery thing. There's a lot of things that went on. So when he heard about self-control, do you think that's going to cause Felix to be a little worried here? Talking about, his marriage is built on betrayal and lies and deceit. Yeah, he's going to be a little nervous. And his third point was the judgment to come, the reason sinners need to repent. All of us are going to appear before God on that day. So Paul's message clearly agitates Felix. He stepped on their toes, just like any good gospel sermon will. So much so that Felix stopped him right in the middle of it and said, "Go away, don't call me, I'll call you. I've got your number." Paul remained in prison for 2 years. Luke actually mentions nothing of Paul's activities except for his frequent conversations with him over that time. We get a little bit of interlude in the next chapter when he talks about when he presents his defense again to Agrippa and Bernice. But we don't know. We don't know what happened to the Gentile delegation that had come to Jerusalem with him. We don't know what Luke's doing, what Timothy's doing, what Titus is doing. We just simply don't know. We know that his friends could attend to his needs and he had some amount of liberty, but we don't know what that entails. We do know that Felix didn't get the bribe that he was hoping for, and so we leave Paul here in prison with this reprobate governor Felix for 2 years until he's finally replaced by Porcius Festus, and that's where Stephen will pick up next week. Thank you for your attention.